Okay, class, the Cornet Project class that is, that meets here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church at 2200 Marshall Road. We will look at a rationale for pre-trib rapture, a rationale for pre-trib rapture, and we might notice some of the, I'm not sure it's highly charged, that is for those who've never really studied it, they have a lot of emotional investment, but that's never the case in a church. We've had people come our way who only wanted to, I wouldn't know what you call it, I guess get their piece of social currency, their piece of silver, and feign great disappointment over something, but they don't really hold a lot of interest. If most people held interest in the Bible, then we wouldn't hear people just tout, let's say, categories without content. Or as the Bible would say, clouds without water. I like that statement, because when we talk about categories, it says, I've said before, there are people who adamantly assert eternal security but couldn't defend it. And that is, they really don't have any more interest than that which they've been taught as far as hearing, which is fine, but they would never even find it of interest to develop their own defense or rationale for that. Now, as a pastor, you can encourage people to learn how to do that, but it's okay for them. They just accept that. They accept local church, the one of which they're a member. They don't really want to know much more than that. You can tell them the church here, being in Jacksonville, Arkansas, is the body of Christ, but people can mistreat the church. They can come in here as though it's just any other organization. So for people to behave in a rationale toward developing a rationale for things like the rapture. Before we get to that word, though, for example, rapture, you hear people say, well, that word's not in the Bible. Well, that's right, it's not. But first, before we go there, since we're a language-based apologetic and outreach, that's a noun. And of course, it could be used as a verb, to be raptured or to rapture. So we're looking at to rapture. So that helps to know that there's a verb in the Bible. In 1 Thessalonians 4:17, so we have a text here, 4:17, and it's in a text that actually has an adverb, which means simultaneously. And it also has another word, preposition here. So we have an adverb and a preposition, and this means together with. And then if you take the verb that's actually in the Bible, when you look this up, if you want to look up rapture and you go to caught up, the English phrase, caught up, then you can come over here to, I'm not sure if I can remember, harpazo. You can check the spelling on that, but it's a rough breed, harpazo. So it says that the dead in Christ would be raised first, then we which are alive and are remaining around, the survivors, if you will be seized away. This is two words. It has apo, away from. Remember, this is a Cornet Project class, so if you're tuning in or viewing this remotely, great, chime in, write all you want. But in this class, we actually are just using the Bible languages to use them as tools of investigation, especially for the type of people that have the character like the Bereans. It's the word eugenic. There we go. Like the word Eugene. If you know a person named Eugene, he's a correct species. So it says a more noble character. So it really, you'd have to have a character that's a little bit not the norm, if you will, to really want to sit down and go through these things. Most people have gone on with their lives, which is great. We have wonderful people here that fellowship. They support the church. They fellowship into the gospel. They assemble for the purpose of the church to assemble, provoke each other into love and unto good works, to assure that Christ receives, that is, the Father receives the glory by Christ, from Christ in this church. And they grow at the full measure of the stature of Christ. They have great lives outside the church. They don't come in and try to disrupt and say, are you a pre or a mid or whatever they try to do. You know how people come in who don't know more than the category. The Bible speaks of them. My friend Dr. Eddie Johnson often says he pointed and reminds me of the seed collectors. They just pick something up, and then you need to be careful because they're just waiting, assuming they would know if you're saying something incorrect, which I've never known such presumption except that which finds when you teach the Bible actually what it says. People who have never even bothered to study it are just sitting there waiting as if they could know if you said something incorrectly. But that was years ago when I first encountered that in the early 80s, before I was even a missionary Baptist. I'd never, my parents took me out of the Lord's church when I was 10, somewhere around there. I didn't return again until I was like 25 maybe. And that was 1987. That was here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. This is the church that ordained me. And I've really enjoyed studying the Bible ever since. Our organizing pastor, Dr. L.D. Foreman, here's one of his books, The Church That Jesus Built. He had, another book here, Bible in 8 Ages, really a good book. It's hardbound. But to come to a church that actually had textbooks in a library, first a library, I knew I was in the right place, and then a pastor who had actually authored books, so that was quite a standard, a bar that was set. And we even have these Life of Christ series, like number 13 here, where he was dealing with the issues of the Lord's Supper, and he said there are arguments pro and con. Now today there's no arguments pro or con, but at this time there were. He says as whether one church member can observe the supper in another church. Now he said can, ability, not may, permission, because granting someone permission does not achieve the ability. A person can no more eat the Lord's Supper just because someone said they may, than someone could say they're holding fast their profession of faith just because someone says they may do that. It's quite an honor to prepare for the Lord's Supper, to examine yourself vertically with God, the head of the church, Jesus Christ, and each other in this covenant community who have deliberately covenanted together for the purpose of demonstrably living out the teachings of Jesus in a manner that it's noticed and noticeable, and people can see our reciprocal love for one another. They can see the covenant life, how we live with the interests of each other. So it's good, though, to have all these old collector's items, and we keep those here in the library, and it's been quite a joy. Like I said, to find a church where people actually have the character to study. For example, this book, The Work of Christ Consummated in 7 Dispensations, J.R. Graves. This is a very old copy of it. It was given me by the teacher of the ladies class, Sister Rosetta Agee. She's long left to be with the Lord. Matter of fact, I've still got in this book, I've got here it is. She left us Friday, April 4, 2008. She was 97 years, 5 months, and 12 days. So it's quite an honor to have this book that she gave me. Of course, they gave these away, more modern or more recent publications from the Texas, the Sunday School, Bogart Press, I'm sorry. But she has this old tract, The Eternal Security of the Believer, or 100 Reasons and 100 Scriptures Proving Eternal Security. This one's yellowed, now it's that old. And her phone number in the front of the book only has 5 digits, so her number is 3-6142. So if you remember how long ago it was, I don't, but if you had this here, for example, and you looked in the table of contents, which I once was able to read that, so my son, who's a techno geek, gave me this. You all know Bo, so leave me alone. But anyway, it says here, let me see, The translation of all living saints, Christ comes in the air for his saints. They are suddenly caught up, glorified, and receive their rewards. They remain in paradise until the tribulation period has passed. And then you can back up to page 391, that chapter. He says the coming of Christ for his saints, the second coming of Christ under two aspects. He comes into the air for his saints, and then there's the resurrection of the just, the translation of or rapture of living saints. They meet their Lord in the air and receive their glorified bodies. Okay, so we've got Dr. J.R. Graves' book that was taught here, faithfully taught here, and the book even handed to the young preacher boy that I was back then. We have books authored. Our organizing pastor, president of Missionary Baptist Seminary for years and years and years and years. We have all these good resources. So studying would be an honor to those who went before us. I'm certain Dr. Foreman, the organizing pastor, would be very encouraged to know that a pastor 70 years later is still referencing the work and finding the learning and the knowledge very advantageous. How could knowledge not be? And then certainly seeing us go forward, even with this apologetic and outreach ministry, you can only imagine what he would think of just how widely the scope of our outreach has become. And then this platform, it neutralizes those who want to disrupt a class, which I had no idea. I'd never seen so much energy to disrupt a class when you want someone. I've always wanted to attend a class where someone taught the rationale for pre-trib rapture. You just couldn't find one unless you attend a seminary where you have a dispensationalist, I suppose. But I think we can use the languages and perhaps even some wisdom in the numbers of the Bible. And I think we can have a rationale that would find why we probably get thrown under this bus of pre-trib rapture. But those who are against people who are primed pre-trib, I don't understand that. I don't understand. I was taught local church, or church being fully a church. We're not a part of a church. We are Christ's body under his headship here. The Bible expressly states that. We believe in baptism by this church of those who believe the gospel, and we baptize those who believe it. We fellowship into the gospel here as a church. And then as the Lord's Supper, for example, we observe it as a unified body, as Christ's body. Now that's very deliberate. So someone to just come here, to pass by here, and in their ignorance, we've had a lot of that where they did not know. They would equate our church, they would judge us, which makes the communion or Lord's Supper about them, and they would come in and judge whether or not we would give them a thimble and bread fragment or bar them from it. Not really sure where that egocentrism came from, except someone taught people to disparage a church that observes it as a church. But now if you know how difficult that is as a pastor like myself, it's very difficult. The process accrues over time, and you train people, especially when you include verse 3 of chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul, in the thesis of that text about the Lord's Supper, reminded them that God's the head of Christ, Christ the head of every man, the husband that is head of the wife. And then we know in the church letters, children are to obey their parents. So here for us at Landmark, fathers are responsible for giving the cup and bread to their baptized children, and they're responsible for preparing their families and bringing them, presenting them here. Husbands are responsible for leading their wives and leading their home to follow Christ. And then he's responsible for giving her, well, it's high honor. Actually, for me, it's the greatest thing I've ever done in my life, and I'll never marginalize that nor care about those who do, because I don't know what goes on in some people's homes who've come here and taken issue. We've had men not want to give their wife a cup and bread, so I don't know where that came from, but that's enough of that. Let's get back to our lesson. What's a rationale for pre-trib? So first, for me, back in the 80s when I was in I was a fan of the Christian Research Institute, a subscriber, not a subscriber, but I was a student of Dr. Walter Martin. I even went to the college he had attended, and he received a degree in comparative religious studies. they didn't have that. So I still went there because it was very encouraging to me to learn. I have my Cults Reference Bible. I have Kingdom of the Cults. I have Essential Christian. Oh, I got several of his books. But I didn't have the tools. I would just listen to him talk. But as early, he died in 1989. So early on, before I was ever here in this church and ever attended a seminary, the Lord used him to find me, and I was very glad for that. And he helped begin to direct me out from all of that vague and ambiguous teaching out there. So he had talked about this tribulation issue, and he seemed a little frustrated by people's willingness to banter. So I was introduced and forewarned by him that people really charge these categories without content, these clouds without water, and advocates have more interest in pressuring you just to go along with an empty phrase. But my question was, where did this come from? Not this. That was second. So this was first for me. This was second, the word rapture. First for me was who made the point of reference for all of this discussion, tribulation. Okay, so, and that was my first question, who made the hinge on which this turns, because in Matthew 24, I believe it says after the tribulation of those days, but notice it didn't say after the great tribulation. So I asked, but no one then cared any more than they do today. I was just very curious about it. It appears there's a little bit more here that we can understand. And let me see if I can find a board. So if you've got this, we're working on pre-trib first. Who made the tribulation the point of reference here? And now we've covered this. So if you need to take a screenshot or whatever, you can always just review this, go back. But we just need some more room, okay? So we'll get rid of the clouds without water. That's just, people will say something. Again, I use the book Eternal Security by Dr. Charles Stanley. People love to read it, but it doesn't mean they could write it. People love to tout it. The phrase eternal security doesn't mean they could defend that. So, and that's okay. It's something I would want for everyone, so they would be great witnesses and more influential in their scope and magnitude of the kingdom of God. But first, Matthew 24, I think it's Matthew, sure it is. It does not say after the great tribulation. So I always started telling people I was a pre-great trib, and that was not good enough because it made people think. And of course, I was told by a dear man once he couldn't remember the last time I preached or taught a class where he didn't have to think to keep up with what I was teaching, and I just told him in jest. He was a good friend of mine, but I said I'm sorry that I provoked him to thought, but it was still funny. It's funny if you think about it, but again, thinking's the problem. One of my dear professors said thinking's hard work. That's why so few people do it. But I think we can see here, there's a lot of vitriol. There's even a video out by a pastor named Stephen Anderson after the tribulation. I've heard great messages about after the tribulation, after the tribulation, after the tribulation. But you just don't hear a lot about the great. But if you'll turn to Revelation chapter 7, and it's easy to remember this, 7:14. It says, I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest, he said to me, these are they which came out of great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood. Now it says out from, and of course you remember Jesus said that the days would be cut off. And you can check that out. But so whatever days those are, they have a definite amount, a determined amount. So let's say the last 3.5 years, for example, that 1,260 days at 360 per year. Yeah, something like that. But well, he said they'd be cut off. So someone asked me once, well, how could they be a determined amount if they'll be shortened? And I was like, that the amount presupposes the reality of cutting it off. So if that's the return of Christ, you see, if that's the return of Christ, the resurrection, and the rapture, which those three R's are all connected in the Bible. And then let's just do a little arithmetic. Daniel 9:25, I remind you from the edict to rebuild, that was 3:14, 445 BC until 4:632 AD, and that was 173,880 days, which translate that was 483 years times 360 days. And we've proven this when you study the ratio in the Bible, how that is irrefutably demonstrated. So we have this, but what we're looking at now is we have 70 weeks times 7, and now we're looking for that 70th week. Well, if you go to Daniel 9:27, we can build quite a case that I can have no problem with Christ's fulfillment of what took place, every bit of it, and the implications being the other shoe to drop. So if the first 3.5 years is behind us, and that's Jesus was cut off, and yet he did all the things 9:27 says, then we have an interval here, and we don't know when the 70th week starts again. That is, we don't know when this 70th week begins or resumes, I should say that. And you can see, like here by now, people really, unless you really are interested in these things, most people just want the conclusion. Like Dr. Terry Parrish said, it's like a vegetable garden. People just want the tomatoes and the squash. They don't necessarily have an interest in gardening. So again, this isn't the kind of class for people who just say, I'm pre-trib, that's all I care about. And I've had someone actually say it, and I don't know why they had the energy to say it to me, and it was confrontational. They emoted outwardly saying, I've already got all that worked out, and I have no idea what that means. I guess I could have stopped studying the Bible in 1985 and known more than most people do today, but I haven't found that to be the case. I had not even attended seminary in 1985, and all I was subscribing to was Dr. Walter Martin of the Christian Research Institute. And the times I came to Landmark was to sit with my girlfriend, and they were real dramatic church, looking for the new pastor after the pastor that was their successful pastor. He left and really left a lot of people, I guess, disillusioned. So after that, they were never quite able to be placated. So pastor after pastor after pastor after pastor. So it really wasn't an environment for education, disciple making. It certainly wasn't a place where people live with the interests of others. It was quite dramatic. So here we've got this. So if you really want to, you don't have to diminish what Christ accomplished at the cross. There's a lot of either or thinking out there, and it's not really anybody's fault. It's just Christ said all the work was finished at the cross, but yet we've been here on the earth for 2,000 more years. So the implication of what he completed is still unfolding for us. So that's real easy for me to appreciate everything that people advocate that Christ accomplished in 927, but then to also realize that there is impending projections, if you will, on what might occur. But the point I was proving is here, when this thing begins to escalate in this middle, this 3.5 years, and Christ has already accomplished the first 3.5, that was his ministry on earth. So we're waiting on this. So there's an interval here. Now I say interval, I don't say gap. I tell you, I have learned not to say gap. When I was in Missionary Baptist Seminary, they didn't teach the gap theory, they taught the gap fact. And it was real adamant, and it was staunchly advocated. It was actually a good case for it from the Bible language, that is. If you and Dr. Foreman, all the founders of the school. So I really don't have any ability to begrudge someone who was scholastic and faithful to build a seminary and send help pastors train and learn, and then go out and start churches, and then that is go preach the gospel and see churches form and come out and assemble and people be baptized and missionaries go all over the world. So I'm not really sure, but I just say interval. It's really much more sophisticated, and so there's an interval between that. We're waiting on that last week to start, but that means the week was interrupted, and that means that as this begins to escalate, you see the first 3.5 years, if we're talking about the 70th week where we have 7 years, well, that first 3.5 really will be nothing happen. It'll be peace and safety, and even Paul warned in the past about the peace and safety advocates that people in 70 AD literally believed them, went inside a walled city, and 1.1 million of them died. Now that's our history as Baptists. It's our history as those who identify with the prevalence of the Lord's churches throughout history. That's our history, and that's our past. And the history of the Lord's churches, that's our history, and the future of the Lord's churches, that's our future. So we don't have any reason to partition the past and have a ill relationship with it, nor the history, nor the future. So the joy of being a Baptist, for me, it was certainly first an honor, knowing how instrumental we were, and that is they were in establishing this country, even referenced in the 2012 book by John Meacham, Pulitzer Prize winning author. Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power was the title of the book. He referenced the Baptist and the wall of separation that was in the correspondence from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association. The Disestablishment of Religion is a very huge, large landmark in American history, with implications of why we have separation churches. Well, actually, there's no church of the United States. So as any good Baptist like myself am trying to be, would tell anyone, you're welcome. So when people say, I don't agree with you, I said, you're welcome. And I'd say, we support pluralism, your freedom of thought, conscience, and speech. So, and I say you're welcome because we're under a state that was under a religion, and it was like Islamic state, Catholic state, Protestant state, Judaic state, the Jewish state. Then, like in Israel today, that political entity in the Middle East, that nation, you are allowed to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, even though this country who preaches the gospel, and because of the gospel we're here, funds them and gives them billions of dollars. Their state is controlled by Judaism, and for them the state and the Judaism are the same. For example, Vatican at Rome is a sovereign state. Well, which one is it, religion or state? Well, there's no such distinction outside of countries or nations, like, for example, like this nation. So if you ever want to follow the trail of blood, you're standing on one of the capstones of that trail. So this interval's here, and when this picks up, somewhere in here, when this covenant is broken, as future construct predicts and forecasts, that's all it is. It's just a construction prediction. But if you really, what I'm trying to solve for you all is that this then begins to escalate. So now how long in this 3.5 years of escalation, and if you ever sat in Dr. John Penn's class, he'll tell you, as you would study in J.R. Graves' work and others, but Dr. Penn will tell you about escalation. Now how far does this escalate before it's cut off by that return or by the rapture? And as Dr. Graves said, he has rapture taking place before any of the 7 years, which I wouldn't know how to quibble over that, and I don't even consider it quibbling. I just am saying that for those of us like myself, I was always interested in the subject. I was really intrigued back in the early, late 70s and 1980 especially. I kept asking, why are we still here? And then in 1991, when George Bush Sr., not Jr., who was also president, announced a new world order in September 11, 1991, I kept saying, well, we're here, and we had the United Nations, we have global religion. And I remember once when a new pope was elected, I think it was John Paul I think was the name. Even Fox News came out and said the world has a new pope, and I thought, well, we're all Catholic, meaning whether you want to be or not, he's presented as the pope of the world, which I had no reason to distract myself or be distracted from my studies, the freedom of conscious thought and speech, my freedom to study the Bible and to live here in the United States, which is not under the control of Rome or Geneva, that Protestant. John Calvin, I think, was part of that type of Protestant state, and not to be under the Judaic state or any of those other things. So that's it. Just kind of if you want to go through. But now there's a good case in the Great Tribulation, because in the Koine text, two definite articles appear. The Great Tribulation. So that's very definitive, very, and it's repeated twice. So you really don't have anything. So I'm not sure why someone who says they're pre-trib would, I mean, I've had people turn off and go out and buy each other lunch just to feign something incited in them. But I've always had to tell people, if you teach the Bible and if you're in a class where you're even discussing it, just be ready, because anytime you introduce knowledge, it could trigger something that was already there before you taught. So that's really not you. As I tell people, I may have pulled the trigger, but I didn't load your gun. That's always funny to say that. Or as one person, he was very vitriolic, very nasty, and I would tell him, I may have tipped your barrel of toxic waste, but I didn't feel it. That was inside of you. So yes, teaching the Bible, unless you're in a seminary where students leave their lives and disrupt their schedules to go and deliberately sit to learn, or unless you're actually in a New Testament church. Otherwise, people just tout, parrot, and really don't have much interest. That's why I say they'll use categories like pre-trib or a word like rapture, and they keep trying to tell you rapture doesn't have to be in the Bible, and then they'll go through all this explanation for it. And I'm still up here, who said the tribulation was the hinge on which this turned? That is according to the future construct. And do we have a rationale for the numbers? Do we have a rationale for a 70th week picking up and starting again? Yes, we have a rationale for the interval. Now, how would I say this is this rationale? The Bible says to be prepared to give a rationale, a reason. I don't have thus saith verse whatever. I can tell you Matthew 24 doesn't say the great tribulation. I can tell you the only occurrence of the tribulation is in Revelation 7:14. So if the distinctions made by the language are prompts and indicators for us, I can receive those and follow those inflections and use of grammar. So that's enough. I've spoken too long. But if you want a rationale for pre-trib, then if you study a little bit, you might see why people, let's say Stephen Anderson is very adamant about after, and others are very adamant about pre, and really we never really find each other settling down long enough. But this is a class in one of the Lord's churches, so I have no horse in a race, nor does anyone else. No one owns this data. No one owns the pre-trib construct. But that's why people have asked, why do I not have any heartburn with people who advocate pre-tribulation? I don't know what that means, to have something emotional held against someone over something that very few people have ever even studied. So I grew up to teach my own class that I would love someone to have taught me when I was growing up, and had someone sort this out. And I acquired the tools by the grace of God to use to do for others what others couldn't necessarily do for me. And it certainly wasn't because they chose not to. It's just we've had so many advantages now through history, and especially 1934, those who gave up their lives to even build a seminary. It's the oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas. So if you don't go forward and learn and grow, it kind of nullifies the purpose for those people to labor and toil and give up their lives. And even in the workplaces I've worked in this area, we've always respected those who went before us, the investment they made, and all the work it took to, let's say, start up a factory, which once wasn't out here in this local area. So you have a good day and enjoy this lesson, and think about it. All the feedback's welcome. Anything you can contribute that would add to, improve. Feedback for us is the breakfast of champions. So you have a good day.